Welcome to Keats House in London and to this special programme on Keats-Shelley 200, a series of events devised by the Keats-Shelley Memorial Association to celebrate the lives and works of John Keats and Percy Bysshe Shelley on the 200th anniversaries of their deaths. Over the course of this programme, we'll be exploring the lives and work of these well-loved poets, interviewing those who have an expertise in or a simple passion for their work, as well as talking to those involved in the commemorations. Welcome to Keats-Shelley 200. John Keats and Percy Bysshe Shelley both died 200 years ago, both of them tragically young. Throughout this programme, we'll be visiting places where they lived and where they wrote their seminal work, and also looking at the impact and influence that they had on the world of literature. The activities were launched in 2019 at the residence of the Italian Ambassador, Raffaele Trombetta, emphasising the way in which the legacies of Keats and Shelley helped to strengthen the ties between the UK and Italy. This house in Hampstead is where John Keats lived for around 20 months from December 1818 until he embarked on his journey to Rome. We spoke to the curator of Keats House, Rob Shakespeare, about how the house might have looked and felt when the poet was here. Rob, tell us about Keats House. When was he here? At what point in his life?
Well, Keats House was built just before Keats moved in here, and he came to live here in December 1818. Famously associated with this place is Ode to a Nightingale. There's a lovely story that Charles Brown tells that in that spring they was just sat having breakfast, heard a nightingale singing in the garden or perhaps nearby on the heath, which you could just look out into at that time. And after breakfast, Keats just got up, walked out into the garden, sat under a plum tree and wrote Ode to a Nightingale. But it was more in the spring of 1819, coupled with a particular event. The Dilke family moved out of their side of the house and rented it to a family called the Brauns. And the oldest daughter of the Braun family, Fanny Braun, Keats had already met, and it was that really that seemed to inspire this amazing outpouring of work in the spring and summer of 1819. It's some of that story that brings many of our visitors to the house. Many people have seen the film Bright Star and come into it from that side of the story and want to know the story of Keats and Fanny Braun's relationship. And there's a really touching bit. After Keats left, he asked Fanny Braun to write to Fanny Keats, his younger sister, and Fanny Braun writes quite regularly to Fanny Keats to keep her informed of what's going on. She even plays a part in her literary and social education, until the point when actually the letters dry up because they both come and live back here for a brief period together before going their separate ways.
I cannot be admired. I'm not a thing to be admired. You are. I love you. All I can bring you is a swooning admiration of your beauty. You absorb me in spite of myself, you alone, for I look not forward with any great pleasure to what is called being settled in the world. I tremble at domestic cares, yet for you I would meet them. Though if it would leave you the happier, I'd rather die than do so.
Bright star, would I were steadfast as thou art, not in lone splendour hung aloft the night, and watching with eternal lives apart, like nature's patient, sleepless eremite, the moving waters at their priest-like task of pure ablution round earth's human shores, or gazing on the new soft-fallen mask of snow upon the mountains and the moors. No, yet still steadfast, still unchangeable, pillowed upon my fair love's ripening breast, to feel forever its soft swell and fall, awake, forever, in a sweet unrest, still to hear her tender taken breath, and so live ever, or else swoon to death.
Charles, just tell me more about what the Keats-Shelley Memorial Association does.
Well, the Keats-Shelley Memorial Association does a number of things. The first thing it does is that it looks after the house in Rome, the Keats-Shelley House in Rome. And within the Keats-Shelley House, there's a museum, and the museum holds a collection, a very important collection. So part of the function of the association is to maintain the museum and to refresh the collection from time to time. We certainly are always on the lookout of any objects that could go into the collection and enhance it. And that is a very important thing that we do. It also has a responsibility to look after the non-Catholic cemetery in Rome, where the two poets are buried, as you know. And we also have a very important function, which is the outreach, both in the UK and in Italy, where we protect and develop the reputation and the skills and the wonderful poetry of the English Romantic poets, especially Keats and Shelley. That's what we do.
Our commemorative events took us to Winchester. This ancient cathedral city has several sites associated with John Keats, who spent time here while he was building his reputation as an aspiring young poet. Guests convened at Winchester College, where the Fellows librarian Richard Foster gave a tour of a display which includes a first edition of Keats's 1819 poems. We heard readings by local poets James Simpson and Stephanie Norgate, and visitors watched an extract of Blue Apple Theatre's production of Frankenstein, performed by Sam Dace and Laurie Morris. This was also performed at St Stephen's International School in Rome.
I suggested that Frankenstein might be an ideal piece, along with things like The Elephant Man, because they give us the chance to, through a very different lens, look at what life is like today in terms of who gets the chance to be part of civic society, who makes the choices whether somebody should or shouldn't be. And we went back to the classic Shelley text rather than kind of reinventing it, because it says something very powerful about the toxic experience of what it means to be isolated, what loneliness can do to people. And of course we work with a cast of people who traditionally 25 years ago, 50 years ago would have been excluded from all sorts of parts of life. And I think I had a little bit of feedback from somebody who was really interested in the piece because she perceived it to be an eco-feminist take on the novel, which I liked. I think we've kind of tried to see what it says about now.
One of the things we have out on display is a first edition of Keats' 1820 poems, and that includes the first printing of To Autumn, which was written when Keats was in Winchester and was inspired in part by his daily walk across the college water meadows. We've also got lots of watercolours and prints that show Winchester at the time of Keats' visit in the early 19th century, so it's possible for visitors to get an idea of what the city and the countryside around it looked like in 1819 when Keats was here.
Where are the songs of spring? Aye, where are they? Think not of them, thou hast thy music too, while barred clouds bloom the soft dying day, and touch the stubble plains with rosy hue. Then in a wailful choir the small gnats mourn among the river sallows, borne aloft or sinking as the light wind lives or dies. And full-grown lambs loud bleat from hilly bourne, hedge crickets sing, and now with treble soft the redbreast whistles from a garden croft, and gathering swallows twitter in the skies.
Keats's work was further celebrated by a special Keats by Candlelight evening hosted at the Soane Museum in London.
John Keats and John Soane had much in common. Both of them came to Rome at an early age. John Keats was 25, Soane was just 24. Both were lifelong lovers of classical art and antiquities. Both came from relatively humble economic backgrounds to achieve greatness in their chosen fields. And both have very special museums which have been created to honour their memories.
Its loveliness increases, it will never pass into nothingness, but still will keep a bower quiet for us and asleep, full of sweet dreams and health and quiet breathing.
The association also commissioned a special film by poetry organisation Apples and Snakes called Content Cottage. I caught up with Adrien Beel, who was involved in the project. Adrien, it's so nice to catch up with you. Tell me how you got involved in this film.
I was invited by Apples and Snakes. They were looking for a number of poets that kind of had that love for the romantics, but were contemporary poets as well.
And what is it about the romantic poets for you?
For me, they were kind of the rock stars of their day. Radical politics, radical in the way that they use language. Now we consider them as a little bit old and a little bit staid, but at the time they were viewed as the kind of young upstarts, and I got a lot of love for that.
And in a way that's what you're doing in the film, isn't it? You're telling young people why to love them. Tell us about the film.
So the concept of the film is that we wanted to portray this generation's kind of like new and up-and-coming creators that were doing things in a new medium, that were trying to kind of make a statement in their own way. And we're like, well, can't really do anything but influencing. Like, influencers are the new content creators. They're the ones showing the world in a new way. And we love this idea of like new creators finding the work of these older creators and realizing that 200 years down the line, the thoughts are the same, the feelings are the same, and maybe the things that were getting left behind in what the kind of new age of creation is that kind of identification with the act of making that the Romantics had, that we could kind of play with in the film.
You choose two poems, you read two poems in the film. Why those two? Tell us what they are and why.
Okay, so the two poems I chose were Belle Dame sans Merci and Ozymandias. Two of them were my favourite poems, some of my favourite poems. But the Belle Dame in particular, it was this idea of seeking something, like yearning for something, and then realising in that seeking and yearning that maybe the thing that you want is not actually good for you and not actually what you want. And I think there's something in that, particularly my character is an influencer who's continuously chasing the new, who's continuously chasing this idea of like, I need to be on the cutting edge, I need to have that relationship with my fans where I'm the one telling them where to go and how to be. And in turn I get that clout. And this idea that the more he gets what he wants, the worse he kind of feels. And that recognition that upon reading the poem that maybe that's the problem. What I'm searching for, what I'm seeking, isn't actually good for me.
Fascinating. What about Ozymandias?
Ozymandias to me is about the idea of legacy and how it can be a dangerous thing to chase, particularly in the day and age we're in, where the idea of being eternal, immortal, standing on that great pile of likes and recognition can be hollow. Ozymandias for me shows rather than tells the idea of this kind of hubris being kind of pointless and kind of empty. Yeah, it's kind of beautiful. Makes you think about that Twitter post or MySpace post or whatever that you wrote in 2006 and like, what if everything about me disappears and the only thing that's remembered is this one little joke I made online or something like that. So yeah, it's kind of beautiful in that sense.
I met a traveller from an antique land who said, 2 vast and trunkless legs of stone stand in the desert. Near them on the sand, half sunk, a shattered visage lies, whose frown and wrinkled lip and sneer of cold command tell that its sculptor well those passions read, which yet survived, stamped on these lifeless things, the hand that mocked them and the heart that fed. And on the pedestal these words appear, my name is Ozymandias, King of Kings.
Ozymandias, of course, by Percy Shelley, who was at school here at Eton from 1805 when he was aged 13. He left in 1810 after 5 adventurous years. He was miserable at first, but he left top of the school and with a host of new friends. It was here that guests gathered for a day of celebration, which started with a lecture by the writer and director Angus Graham Campbell on Shelley's school days. And then people were able to wander around the buildings and the grounds here, which were once Shelley's domain.
Today's lecture was called Romantic Rebel, Shelley's Etonian Days. I think the things that most interested me, because they haven't been gone into in such detail in the biographies, and certainly not in the contemporary accounts of his time at Eton, was his participation in the strange traditional ceremony of Montem, when the school gathered and dressed up in fancy dress and paraded along with the King and the Queen to Slough, to Salt Hill, where they had some strange flag-waving ceremony, and it all culminated in a great big feast. Now, the interesting thing about this is that Shelley was, of course, a Republican, a pacifist. The idea of soldiers and swords were complete anathema to him. But in 1808, he was sufficiently senior in the school to be one of the boys who would be dressed in military uniform. So in 1808, when he was about 17, Shelley would have been dressed in a plumed helmet, a red coat, white breeches, and carrying a sword, i.e. dressed like a British military officer. And that sort of comes pretty strangely when you think of the later image of him as being a pacifist, anti-army, anti-violence, and so on. Particularly interesting really was our visit towards what's called Sixth Form Bench, which is a bench by the river and is shown on a map of 1798, which is here in the library. You can actually see the bench on the map, and although the woodwork has been replaced over the centuries, we know that that's where Shelley, as a sixth former, as a special privilege with his friends, could go and sit on that bench by the river and discuss poetry or whatever they'd like to do. And it is very close to a lovely little walk past a pond, which is called Poet's Walk, where he would have gone with his friends. It's not actually named after him, it's named after one of his favourite poets, the old Etonian Thomas Gray.
The head of English, Dr. Anna Camilleri, also showed us the fascinating romantics collection held here in the college library.
So Eton College Library is our archive, and it's a working archive, so we continue to make acquisitions each year. And in fact, half of the items that you see around me were acquired in the past probably 20 to 30 years by Michael Meredith. So we've got around 40 objects and texts on display, so a combination of first editions, manuscripts. We have a bust of Shelley, we have a painting by Severn, and we also have Keats's death mask. So what we wanted to do was to not only have an exhibition that illustrated the rich and exciting life that Shelley led in books and in literature, and his association with other writers and thinkers, so particularly Keats, because this is a Keats-Shelley Memorial Association event, but also Byron and also Leigh Hunt and Leigh Hunt's wife, who carved one of the most impressive busts of Shelley. In fact, the only one we have, the only likeness we have, where someone who really knew him well carved a bust. The other bust by Story, which is in Upper School, is not from life.
And it was here in the college library that I also caught up with Rosie Cavaliero, another ambassador of Keats-Shelley 200, who's had a long relationship with the association.
Well, my association with it is through my father, Rosie Cavaliero, who worked for the British Council for about 30 years. One of his postings was Rome, which I remember very well because I was a child there and went to school there. And he was involved then with the Keats-Shelley House. And later on, his passion continued, and he was trustee and treasurer of the Keats-Shelley Memorial Association.
Do you have a sense of what the poets mean to younger people today?
So I think the idea of nature, the preservation of beauty, would resonate definitely with young people now in terms of saving the planet.
So interesting what you say, because Shelley, of course, was at school here. He may well have studied here in this library, so he was at the heart of the establishment, but he was a rebel.
Exactly. And he flew in the face of conservatism, didn't he? So, you know, if he was around today, goodness knows what he'd be doing. But yeah, he everything about them, I think, it represents youth and passion and rebellion and beauty, and I think the whole sort of the transient nature of their lives, and the fact that, you know, Keats lost so many people as well in his very, very short life, and I think that must have had a huge effect on his work.
In the summer of 2022, guests gathered at St Pancras Old Church in London to hear about its links with Shelley and his wider family through a talk given by Paul Hamilton, Emeritus Professor of English at Queen Mary, University of London.
My principal subject of research and my principal interest was European Romanticism. I wrote a short book on Shelley, but I've always been primarily interested in situating Shelley in the context of European Romanticism. What particularly interested me about Shelley was the way in which, in simply writing about his poetry, you also got the chance to write about politics, about philosophy, about all sorts of things that this extremely able intellectual and creative man was interested in. I've said you can't talk about Percy Shelley really without also talking about Mary Shelley. But in a churchyard where the first interment took place, it's irresistible to recover the family history of this extraordinary couple. That means going back to the philosopher William Godwin and to the great feminist philosopher, novelist and general writer Mary Wollstonecraft, whose marked grave is the grave still here. And I'm going to resume their relationship and how they came together and became the parents of Mary Shelley. The story of their lives is one which is a very fraught one. It's full of pain and heartbreak. It's full of love and passion as well. And it's above all the setting in which they wrote their wonderful works.
Histories of Keats and Shelley have helped to strengthen the ties between the UK and Italy, which is where we now go. As we know, Keats and Shelley found their way to Italy in different ways. Keats travelled here to Rome from London in desperate search of warmer climes. He was very ill with tuberculosis, and it was the cruel illness that was to take his life. In November 1820, Keats's doctor James Clark found him and his companion Joseph Severn a room here overlooking the Spanish Steps. It's in this house in Rome that Keats spent his last few months. Until he became too ill to leave his bed, Keats found the hustle and the bustle of the Spanish Steps a constant distraction. In December 1820, he suffered a relapse and finally passed away in February 1821. But the Shelleys found themselves in Italy in very different circumstances. Mary and Percy spent most of their lives together abroad in semi-imposed exile. They travelled with friends and family through Italy, first settling in Pisa and then moving to the Casa Magni in San Terenzo in April 1822. It was there that Shelley lovers from around the world gathered to celebrate their lives and work through the Gulf of Poets Festival as part of Keats-Shelley 200.
The legacy of those poets that I sometimes think of and describe as the Sex Pistols of their day, you know, those romantics, Byron and Keats, and Shelley is that they didn't live into grand old age. It's hard to know. I mean, Wordsworth, to some extent, is the great example of somebody from that era who matured and developed into different sensibilities and found a different style of writing. It's almost impossible to think of an older Shelley. The work is so youthful, so exuberant, so passionate. You can't think of him as somebody who decided to put his slippers on and his smoking jacket and wander gracefully into old age. I suspect that the configurations of atoms in his brain was really what made Shelley. I just think he was an oddball, a genuine one-off. They broke the mold when they made Shelley. I mean, he was bullied a great deal as a child, but seemed to keep standing back up. And he was eccentric, and I think the eccentricity won through in the end. He had a great number of admirers. A person that in the end you wanted to believe and do well for himself.
This festival has been extraordinary. In a way, you take a step back from something which so many people have contributed to in their own very particular way. And so you couldn't have anticipated how it would affect you. From the wonderful view up to the castle, from seeing photographs of the Casa Magni before, when Shelley was living in it, when it was practically falling into the sea anyway. I mean, it's no wonder it feels like a shipwreck before you've even started. And poets have an extraordinary effect, I find, on reminding you of the other layers to life that exist. Always slightly under the surface, but here they all come to the top and they're riding the waves. And here 4 such wonderful poets reading their work, very different, but all of them superb poets, has been very moving, very touching and very haunting. And to sit in the park next to the Casa Magni and hear them reading was a highlight for me.
Lift not the painted veil, which those who live call life, though unreal shapes be pictured there, and it but mimic all we would believe with colours idly spread. Behind lurk fear and hope, twin destinies, whoever weave their shadows o'er the chasm, sightless and drear. I knew one who had lifted it. He sought, for his lost heart was tender, things to love, but found them not, alas. Nor was there aught the world contains, the which he could approve. Through the unheeding many he did move, a splendour among shadows, a bright blot upon this gloomy scene, a spirit that strove for truth and, like the preacher, found it not.
The Keats-Shelley House stands today as a museum to commemorate the work of the Romantic poets. It was bought by the newly established Keats-Shelley Memorial Association in 1906, and it opened to the public 3 years later. Since then, the popularity of the Romantic poets has continued to grow, and tens of thousands of people come to Rome to commemorate and celebrate these beloved poets. The Keats-Shelley Memorial Association is also in charge of looking after Keats and Shelley's graves, both of which are here in Rome in the non-Catholic cemetery. And it was here that we gathered for our final Keats-Shelley 200 event. Keats was buried here. On his request, his name was never on his grave. Instead, he's recognised as a young English poet, and the words, "Here lies one whose name was writ in water." His friend and travelling companion, Joseph Severn, commissioned a plaque with the acrostic poem spelling out Keats. Severn was then buried next to John Keats nearly 60 years later when he passed away at the age of 85.
I cannot see what flowers are at my feet, nor what soft incense hangs upon the boughs, but embalmed darkness guess each sweet, wherewith the seasonable month endures, the grass, the thicket, and the fruit tree wild, white hawthorn, and the pastoral eglantine. Fast fading violets covered up in leaves, and mid-May's eldest child, the coming musk rose, full of dewy wine.
The poet Percy Bysshe Shelley is also remembered here at this cemetery. He died in the Bay of Spezia, and his body was cremated on the beach near Viareggio. His ashes were then stored in Rome before being buried here at the non-Catholic cemetery just a year after Keats.
Go thou to Rome, at once the paradise, the grave, the city, and the wilderness, and where its wrecks like shattered mountains rise, and flowering weeds and fragrant copses dress the bones of desolation's nakedness. Pass till the spirits of the spot shall lead thy footsteps to a slope of green access, where, like an infant's smile, over the dead a light of laughing flowers along the grass is spread, and grey walls mould around, on which dull time feeds, like slow fire upon a hoary brand, and one keen pyramid, with wedge sublime, pavilioning the dust of him who planned this refuge for his memory, doth stand like flame transformed to marble. And beneath, a field is spread, on which a newer band have pitched in heaven's smile their camp of death, welcoming him we lose with scarce extinguished breath.
As we've seen, the past 2 years have been ones of commemoration and celebration of Keats and Shelley. And through Keats-Shelley 200, we've been able to bring people together to all share our love of the works of the Romantic poets. But most of all, through Keats-Shelley 200, we have continued to create a legacy for the poets, which the next generation can take forward. This is what the Keats-Shelley Memorial Association is all about, preserving the Romantic poets' lives and works for generations to come. This is done through our work at the Keats-Shelley House, the Keats-Shelley Poetry Prizes, conservation of their graves, and supporting educational activities in Italy and the UK. We hope that the events of Keats-Shelley 200 demonstrate the passion that continues to exist for their work. And we hope too that people across the world continue to find in the works of John Keats and Percy Bysshe Shelley inspiration, solace, and even joy. Thank you for watching.